The next thing to have a look at is how we can integrate ASP.NET Web API into that same pipeline. But just as with NancyFX, I'm not going to give you a whole tour of how to build applications using ASP.NET Web API. There are other courses out there that will do that for you. Instead, I'm going to build a very simple application that we can plug into our OWIN pipeline just to see how it works. And just as with NancyFX, the first thing I need to do is go off to NuGet and get the packages that I need. In this case, the package I need is microsoft.asp.net.webapi.owin. With that package installed, I'm just going to go ahead and create a controllers directory in my project, so I got somewhere to store my Web API controllers. With that in place, I can now go ahead and add my first controller. I'm just going to call it Hello World API Controller. And to convert it from a simple C# class into an actual API controller, I'm just going to set it up so it inherits from API controller. And API controller is located in system.web.http. And now that my Hello World API controller is a proper web API controller, it is time to create what is called an action. An action is a public method that returns iHTTP action result, and it can be named whatever you want. In my case, I'm going to call it Hello World. Inside the action, I need to define what I want to return to the client. In this case, I want to return some content, so I'm going to use the content method from the base class. The first thing I need to pass into this method is the status code that I want to return to the client. In this case, I want to return a 200 OK. The second parameter to this method is the content that I want to return back to the client. And seeing that I was apparently born with very little imagination, I'm just going to go ahead and return hello from Web API. I now have a fully working Web API controller with an action that can be called. However, I need to add a couple of attributes to it for it to register properly. I'm going to start off by adding a route prefix attribute with the value API. This tells Web API that the requested path has to start with API for this controller to be considered. I then add a route attribute to my action with the value hello. This finalizes the path needed to reach this action from the outside. So the path is going to be /API for the controller and /hello for this action. And finally, I add an HTTP GET attribute to my action. This tells the system that this action can be reached using the HTTP GET verb. With that in place, the only thing left to do is to register Web API in the OWIN pipeline and make sure that the Hello World API controller responds as it should. So let's head over to the startup.cs file and do that. The first thing we need to do to get ASP.NET Web API into our OWIN pipeline is to create an HTTP config object. This config object contains all the configuration needed for Web API to run. In our case, we don't need a whole lot of configuration. All we need to do is make sure that it maps all of the attributed routes that we set up. To do that, I'm just going to call config.mapHTTPAttributeRoutes. This will cause the configuration to go through our application looking for any API controllers it can find and map the attributed routes that we put in there. In our case, it's just going to find that one API controller and set up that one route that we have defined, which is exactly what we needed to do. And now that we have the configuration in place, we can just go ahead and add Web API to the OWIN pipeline. And we do this just as we've done before. We just call the useWebAPI extension method on the IAppBuilder interface, and we pass in the HTTP configuration object to it. But since I'm obviously a little bit too predictable when it comes to naming my variables, I managed to name my config variable the same thing that I did down in the delegate for the use Nancy statement. So I'm just going to have to rename that to conf to make sure that they don't collide. So with that sorted out, let's just press F5 and see if everything works as it should. Okay, so we're getting Hello World back, which I'm getting a little bit bored of by now, but anyhow. Let's just start off by seeing if Nancy still responds as it should. And yes, it does. We do get hello from Nancy, so that seems to be working. Let's now see if Web API is responding as it should. So the URL we should be using for that is /API/hello. But you're going to see when I press enter here, the response is probably not what you expect it to be. So instead of getting some visual thing in my browser, I get some weird download thing here. And the reason for that is that Web API will default to returning JSON to my browser. And since IE doesn't really know how to handle JSON, it just asks me if I want to open it or save it. So I'm just going to go ahead and open it. But as I obviously don't have a program registered for reading JSON files, I'm just going to go ahead here and have a look and find Notepad. So there it is, and have a look at it. And there it is. Hello from Web API within quotes. That makes it JSON. And that means that everything seems to be working. That means that we now have both NancyFX and ASP.NET Web API running inside of that OWIN pipeline.